Welcome to International Trade Minute, Quick Fire Trade News, the essential podcast for today's trade professionals, presented to you by Rydell Law Firm. If you're a seasoned practitioner, this is where you'll find your weekly distilled briefing on the pulse of international commerce and regulation. We bring you the latest legal and trade news, distilled into straightforward, bite-sized updates for busy trade professionals. Sponsored by Rydell Law Firm, this podcast is crafted by expert trade attorneys to keep you ahead of the curve with concise, actionable insights. Perfect for your morning commute or coffee break. Stay informed without the fluff. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and join our professional community on LinkedIn. Today, we are exploring significant developments in trade policy and enforcement, including the upcoming USMCA review, potential changes in China trade strategy, notable export violations, and updates on sanctions enforcement. Let's get started. Our first story focuses on the upcoming USMCA review, where experts anticipate significant pressure from the U.S. side, particularly with Trump's potential return to office. The 2026 review could start earlier than expected, creating substantial uncertainty for investment and supply chain planning across North America. Industry experts suggest that the U.S. might initially signal its unwillingness to renew the agreement, though this wouldn't trigger an immediate exit. What's particularly concerning is the lack of clarity in the agreement's language about how to resolve such situations. Under the current framework, each country would have annual opportunities over a decade to decide whether to continue with the agreement. The automotive sector stands as a key focal point in these discussions. With regional value, content requirements already increased from 62.5% to 75%. Manufacturers are struggling to meet existing standards. There's growing concern about Chinese companies potentially establishing assembly and core parts plants in Mexico to access the U.S. market, particularly in the EV sector where China's BYD leads globally. Several other contentious issues are likely to surface during the review, including market access for U.S. dairy exports to Canada, Mexico's stance on genetically modified corn, and Canada's digital services tax. The review process could also address less controversial areas such as regulatory alignment, competition policy, and temporary entry procedures. Trade practitioners should particularly note that the uncertainty surrounding the review process could significantly impact investment decisions. Companies may need to reassess their North American manufacturing and sourcing strategies, especially in the automotive sector. The possibility of a stricter interpretation of rules of origin and potential new barriers to Chinese investment in Mexico should factor into long-term planning decisions. Up next, for immediate action, businesses should review their USMCA compliance procedures, particularly in light of ongoing disputes about rules of origin calculations and certification processes. It's also advisable to develop contingency plans for potential changes in tariff structures and regulatory requirements. Looking ahead to a potential Trump administration, experts are projecting significant expansions to current restrictions on U.S. investments in China's technology sector. The outbound investment program, set to take effect this January, is expected to remain firmly in place with possible broadening of its scope beyond the current focus on semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing sectors. Administration insiders suggest we could see these restrictions extend into other Chinese technology sectors, with a deeper reach into existing controlled industries. There's also serious consideration being given to including passive investment flows, particularly in publicly traded securities, which were largely exempted from current Treasury regulations. The semiconductor export control landscape is likely to see continued tightening, building upon existing restrictions on advanced chips and manufacturing equipment exports to China. We can expect regular updates to close potential loopholes and strengthen existing controls, following the pattern established by previous administrations. Early indicators point to the increasing influence of China hawks in key positions, with notable appointments like Senator Marco Rubio's potential nomination as Secretary of State. This signals a continuation and possible intensification of the hardline stance on technology transfers to China. Moving forward with our next story, trade practitioners should prepare for more stringent compliance requirements and expanded reporting obligations. The administration may pursue these changes either through executive action or by working with Congress to broaden the scope of restrictions. While congressional approaches to outbound investment have varied, there's growing momentum for a more unified strategy under potential new committee leadership. For those managing international technology investments or semiconductor exports, it's crucial to maintain flexibility in compliance programs and be prepared for more frequent regulatory updates. The steady ramp-up of controls may require regular reassessment of business strategies, particularly for companies with significant exposure to Chinese markets or supply chains. In a significant enforcement action, the Bureau of Industry and Security has levied a $5.4 million fine against M&M Wireless, a New York City electronics store, for serious export violations. The company and its 3 owners must also forfeit over $460,000 and complete mandatory export compliance training within the next year. The investigation revealed 94 violations of export administration regulations, with the company significantly understating quantities in at least 4 shipments to Dubai. In one particularly egregious case, a shipment declared to contain 134 items worth $28,000 actually contained 600 items. Another shipment's true value exceeded $462,000, despite being declared at just $65,700. The violations extended beyond misreporting. M&M Wireless failed to maintain required export documentation for 90 separate sales transactions. Despite their use of a freight forwarder, the company remained legally responsible as the U.S. principal party in interest for ensuring accurate export information. The settlement includes a 3-year probationary period, during which any additional export control violations could result in suspended export privileges. This case serves as a stark reminder of the importance of accurate export declarations and proper record keeping, even when working through intermediaries. Trade practitioners should note that the use of freight forwarders does not absolve exporters of their compliance responsibilities. This case demonstrates BIS's commitment to enforcing both documentation requirements and accurate reporting obligations, regardless of a company's size or industry sector. Shifting our attention to China, the Ministry of Commerce has just released its new dual-use export control list, which takes effect December 1st alongside recently issued regulations. This marks a significant development in China's export control framework. The new list introduces a structured classification system that mirrors the U.S. Commerce Control List format. Each controlled item receives a 5-character code that identifies its industry field, type, control rationale, and specific categorization. While this reorganization doesn't introduce new controls, it consolidates existing ones into a more systematic format. According to Bureau of Industry and Security Senior Export Control Officer Jose Rodriguez in Beijing, this development primarily represents an administrative restructuring. However, trade experts anticipate this could be laying the groundwork for China to implement additional controls in the future. For trade practitioners, this streamlined approach signals China's move toward a more sophisticated export control regime. The classification system's similarity to U.S. controls suggests potential implications for companies managing dual-use exports in both jurisdictions. In our next segment, this systematic approach to dual-use controls could present new compliance considerations for businesses operating in China, particularly as future controls may be more readily implemented under this framework. In a significant enforcement action, OFAC has levied a substantial $1 million penalty against a U.S. citizen for deliberately evading Iran sanctions through an elaborate hotel investment scheme. The case reveals sophisticated attempts to circumvent U.S. sanctions using foreign money services and informal value transfer systems. The individual orchestrated a complex plan to purchase and operate a 19-suite hotel along the Caspian Sea between 2019 and 2022. The scheme involved selling existing Iranian property and channeling U.S.-based funds through a Canadian money services business that provided informal transfer mechanisms to access funds in Iran without direct cross-border movements. Particularly concerning was the individual's use of sanctioned Iranian banks, including Bank Melli and Bank Keshavarzi, for both personal and business transactions. After their initial U.S. bank terminated services due to suspicious activities, the perpetrator opened new accounts and attempted to conceal the Iranian connections by using owned companies and removing explicit references to Iran from transaction records. OFAC's investigation revealed 75 distinct violations valued at over $500,000. While the maximum penalty could have exceeded $27 million, OFAC considered mitigating factors, including the individual's limited sanctions expertise. However, the deliberate nature of the violations and lack of cooperation during the investigation led to the significant penalty. This case underscores the importance of robust banking controls in detecting sanctions evasion, particularly informal value transfer systems operating within U.S. borders. Financial institutions are encouraged to maintain vigilance over suspicious transaction patterns and report potential violations promptly to prevent further sanctions breaches. That concludes today's rapid-fire update of the latest developments in international trade. Thanks for tuning in to International Trade Minute. We hope you found today's episode insightful and useful for your practice. Remember, our podcast is brought to you by Rydell Law Firm, your trusted partner in navigating international trade law. Don't miss our next episode. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Stay connected and continue the conversation with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, stay informed and stay ahead.